Elena Martinez stood in front of her small bedroom mirror, smoothing down the soft blue fabric of her grandmother's dress one last time. The vintage gown had been carefully stored in tissue paper for over 20 years, and tonight was the first time anyone had worn it since her grandmother Rosa passed away. The dress wasn't fancy by today's standards, but it had a timeless elegance that made Elena feel connected to the woman who had raised her with so much love. She picked up the small silver locket that had also belonged to her grandmother and fastened it around her neck. Inside was a tiny photo of her and Rosa from when Elena was just 8 years old, both of them smiling in their tiny apartment kitchen. That kitchen had always smelled like fresh bread and cinnamon, and Rosa would tell Elena stories about the fancy places where she worked as a housekeeper. Tonight, Elena was finally going to see one of those fancy places for herself. The Grandview Country Club was hosting its annual charity gala, and after months of saving every spare dollar from her part-time job at the club's restaurant, she had managed to buy a ticket. The money could have gone toward her college textbooks or helped with rent, but Elena felt drawn to attend this particular event. The gala was raising money for the Children's Hospital, the same place that had saved her little brother Diego's life 3 years ago, when he was diagnosed with leukemia. Elena remembered those terrifying months of sleeping in hospital waiting rooms, watching her brother fight for his life while their family struggled to pay the mounting medical bills. The hospital's charity program had covered most of Diego's treatment, and Elena had promised herself that one day she would give back to help other families going through the same nightmare. She grabbed her small black purse, checking for the 3rd time that her ticket was safely inside. The piece of paper represented so much more than just entry to a party. It was her chance to finally contribute to something bigger than herself, even if her contribution would be small compared to the wealthy donors who would be there. The bus ride to the upscale part of town took 45 minutes, and Elena spent most of it staring out the window, watching the neighborhoods change from modest apartment buildings to sprawling mansions with perfectly manicured lawns. She had cleaned some of these houses during summer breaks, working alongside her mother's cleaning service to earn extra money for college. She knew what these homes looked like on the inside, with their marble floors and crystal chandeliers, but she had always been just invisible help, someone who came and went without the owners even noticing. Tonight would be different. Tonight she wouldn't be wearing a cleaning uniform or carrying a mop bucket. She would walk through the front door as a guest, not as hired help. The Grandview Country Club appeared like something from a movie as Elena stepped off the bus at the ornate entrance gates. The building was a stunning white mansion with tall columns and perfectly symmetrical windows, glowing warm yellow in the evening light. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway as elegantly dressed people made their way toward the entrance. Elena could hear classical music drifting from inside, mixed with the gentle sound of laughter and conversation. She took a deep breath and joined the stream of guests walking toward the main entrance. A doorman in a crisp uniform greeted each arrival with a polite nod, and Elena felt her heart racing as she approached him. She fumbled in her purse for her ticket, hoping her hands weren't shaking too obviously. "Good evening, miss," the doorman said kindly, taking her ticket and scanning it quickly. "Welcome to the Grandview Country Club. The cocktail reception is in the main ballroom, straight ahead through those doors." Elena thanked him and stepped inside, immediately feeling overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding her. The entrance hall had marble floors that gleamed under an enormous crystal chandelier, and fresh flowers in tall vases filled the air with a sweet fragrance. Oil paintings in golden frames lined the walls, showing scenes of fox hunts and pastoral landscapes that probably cost more than Elena's family made in a year. She followed the sound of voices and music toward the ballroom, pausing at the entrance to take in the scene before her. The room was enormous, with a ceiling so high that it seemed to disappear into shadows above the sparkling chandelier. Round tables covered in crisp white linens were arranged throughout the space, each decorated with elaborate centerpieces of white roses and gold ribbons. A small orchestra played soft jazz music on a raised platform at one end of the room, while white-gloved servers moved gracefully between the guests, offering champagne and fancy appetizers on silver trays. But it was the people that made Elena feel most out of place. The women wore gowns that probably cost thousands of dollars, in rich fabrics like silk and velvet, with jewelry that caught the light every time they moved. The men looked equally polished in expensive tuxedos and tailored suits, their watches and cufflinks gleaming with what Elena assumed were real diamonds and gold. Elena smoothed her grandmother's dress again and stepped into the room, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, declining the champagne since she didn't drink alcohol. The bubbles tickled her nose as she took a small sip, using the moment to observe the crowd around her. She recognized a few faces from local news and newspapers. The mayor was holding court near the silent auction tables, surrounded by people who hung on his every word. Several city council members were scattered throughout the room, along with business owners whose names Elena had seen on billboards and storefronts around town. These were the people who made decisions that affected her community, who controlled budgets and policies, but who lived in a completely different world from the one Elena knew. A server approached with a tray of delicate-looking appetizers, and Elena politely took a small pastry filled with something that tasted expensive but unfamiliar. She wasn't used to fancy food, but she tried to eat it gracefully, wiping her fingers carefully on the cloth napkin provided. As she stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the club's golf course, Elena caught her reflection in the glass. Her grandmother's dress looked beautiful in this setting, she realized. The simple cut and quality fabric had a classic elegance that didn't look out of place among all the designer gowns. Rosa had always told her that true style came from carrying yourself with dignity, not from how much money you spent on clothes. Elena thought about her grandmother working in places like this, probably cleaning these same windows and polishing these same marble floors. Rosa had spent her whole life taking care of other people's homes and families, never complaining about the long hours or difficult work. She had saved every penny she could to help Elena get an education, always believing that her granddaughter could build a better life. Standing in this beautiful room, surrounded by all this wealth and privilege, Elena felt the weight of her grandmother's sacrifices and dreams. She was here tonight not just to support the children's hospital, but to prove to herself that she belonged in spaces like this, that her dreams of becoming a teacher and helping kids in her community were possible. She just had to get through the evening without anyone realizing how nervous she was, or how different her world was from theirs. Elena had been standing by the silent auction tables for about 20 minutes, studying the donation items and trying to calculate which ones she might be able to bid on with her limited budget. A weekend getaway to a mountain resort was way out of her price range, but maybe she could afford to bid on the handmade pottery set or the gift certificate to a local restaurant. She was examining a beautiful painting donated by a local artist when she heard laughter behind her. Not the warm, friendly kind of laughter that had been filling the room all evening, but something sharper, more pointed. Elena glanced over her shoulder and noticed a group of young women about her age gathered near the champagne fountain, their voices carrying just a little too loudly over the background music. The group seemed to be led by a tall, blonde woman, wearing a stunning red gown that probably cost more than Elena's rent for 6 months. Her jewelry caught the light every time she gestured, and she moved with the confident posture of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Elena recognized her from photos in the local newspaper's society pages. Madison Ashworth, the mayor's daughter, known for her charity work and social events. Elena tried to focus back on the auction items, but she could feel eyes on her. The uncomfortable sensation of being watched made her skin prickle, and she found herself smoothing down her grandmother's dress nervously. She moved to the next table, pretending to be fascinated by a collection of wine bottles donated by a local vineyard. "Oh my goodness, look at that dress," she heard one of the women say, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "It's so vintage." Elena's cheeks burned as she realized they were talking about her. She kept her eyes fixed on the auction catalog in her hands, hoping they would lose interest and move on to another topic. The music seemed to fade into the background as she became hyper-aware of every whisper and giggle from the group behind her. "I mean, it's actually kind of sweet," another voice chimed in, "like something from a costume party or a thrift store. Very authentic." Madison's voice rose above the others, clear and cutting. "I think it's precious how some people try so hard to fit in. You have to admire the effort even if the execution is a little, well, you know." Elena's hands tightened on the catalog, her knuckles turning white. She had dealt with mean girls before, during high school and even at her part-time jobs. But somehow it felt worse here, in this beautiful room where she had hoped to feel like she belonged. She took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was here. This wasn't about fitting in with people like Madison. This was about supporting the children's hospital and honoring her grandmother's memory. She moved to the next auction table, hoping to put some distance between herself and the cruel comments. But the group seemed to follow her, their conversation continuing just loudly enough for her to hear every word. "I wonder how she even got a ticket," Madison said, her voice filled with mock curiosity. "These events are usually for members and their guests only. Maybe she's someone's plus one, though I can't imagine who would bring—" Elena felt her face growing hot with embarrassment and anger. She wanted to turn around and tell them exactly how she had earned her ticket, how she had saved for months and sacrificed other things to be here. But she also knew that engaging with them would only make things worse. People like Madison fed on conflict and drama. She tried to move toward the other side of the room, but her path was blocked by other guests mingling around the cocktail tables. As she waited for a gap to open up, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Elena turned around to find Madison standing directly behind her, flanked by 3 other women who were all wearing expressions of barely concealed amusement. "Excuse me," Madison said with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I just had to ask about your dress. It's so unique. Where did you find it?" Elena's throat felt dry, but she managed to speak. "It belonged to my grandmother," she said quietly, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Oh, how sweet," Madison cooed, stepping closer. "A family heirloom. That's so charming." She reached out as if to touch the fabric, and Elena instinctively stepped back. "The workmanship is interesting," Madison continued, her friends giggling behind her. "It's very handmade looking, not like the professional tailoring you usually see at events like this." Elena felt trapped between the auction table behind her and Madison's group in front of her. Other guests were starting to notice the conversation, turning to watch what was happening. Elena could feel dozens of eyes on her, and her heart began racing with anxiety. "I'm sorry, but I should get back to looking at the auction items," Elena said, trying to step around Madison politely. But Madison moved to block her path, her smile becoming even more predatory. "Oh, don't be shy. I'm genuinely curious about vintage fashion. Tell me, did your grandmother make this herself? It has that homemade quality that's so authentic." The way she said authentic made it sound like an insult. Elena's patience was wearing thin, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Yes, she made it herself. She was very talented." "I'm sure she was," Madison said, taking another step closer. "It's just so different from what we usually see here. Very rustic." Elena tried once more to move past the group, but as she stepped forward, Madison suddenly lurched backward as if Elena had bumped into her. In the process, Madison's high heel came down hard on the hem of Elena's dress. The sound of tearing fabric cut through the ambient noise of the party like a knife. Elena felt the dress pull away from her body as the vintage material, weakened by years of careful storage, gave way under the sudden pressure. The tear started at the knee and ripped all the way down to the hem, creating a long, jagged gap that exposed Elena's simple black shoes and bare leg. "Oh no," Madison exclaimed loudly, her voice carrying across the nearby area and drawing even more attention. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see you there." But Elena could see the satisfaction in Madison's eyes, the barely suppressed smirk that contradicted her words of apology. This hadn't been an accident. Madison had deliberately stepped on her dress, knowing exactly what would happen to the delicate fabric. Elena stood frozen in shock, staring down at the ruined dress that had meant so much to her. The beautiful blue fabric hung in tatters, and she could feel the cool air conditioning on her exposed leg. Around her, she heard the intake of breath from other guests who had witnessed the incident, followed by whispered conversations, and the unmistakable sound of phones being pulled out to capture the moment. "Poor thing," one of Madison's friends said in a stage whisper that was clearly meant to be heard. Maybe someone should have warned her about wearing such old fabric to an event like this. Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes as she looked down at her grandmother's ruined dress. This wasn't just clothing that had been damaged. It was one of the few physical connections she had to the woman who had raised her, who had worked so hard to give Elena opportunities for a better life. Now it was destroyed, and Elena was standing in the middle of a room full of wealthy strangers, exposed and humiliated. She tried to hold the torn fabric together with one hand while reaching into her purse for her phone with the other, thinking she should call someone to pick her up. But her hands were shaking, and she fumbled with the small clutch, nearly dropping it in her nervousness. Madison and her friends were still standing there, making no move to help or give Elena space to recover. If anything, they seemed to be enjoying the spectacle they had created. Maybe the club has a sewing kit somewhere, Madison suggested helpfully, though her tone suggested she found the whole situation amusing rather than concerning. Elena finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than she had intended. "I just need to," she started, but she wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. She needed to leave, to get away from all these staring faces and whispered comments, but she also didn't want to give Madison the satisfaction of seeing her run away in tears. Elena stood there holding the torn fabric of her grandmother's dress, feeling like the entire room was spinning around her. The whispers seemed to be getting louder, and she could see people pointing discreetly in her direction. Some guests had their phones out, and Elena realized with horror that videos of her humiliation were probably already being recorded and shared. Madison and her friends continued to hover nearby, their fake concern becoming more obvious with each passing moment. "Such a shame about vintage clothing," Madison said to one of her friends, speaking just loud enough for Elena to hear. "It's so fragile, really not practical for events like this." Elena felt her chest tightening as she struggled to hold back tears. She had never felt so alone in a room full of people. Every face around her seemed to belong to strangers who saw her as entertainment, as a curiosity who had wandered into a world where she clearly didn't belong. The beautiful ballroom that had seemed so magical when she first arrived now felt like a trap. She was trying to figure out how to make it to the exit without causing an even bigger scene when she noticed the crowd beginning to part slightly. People were stepping aside, creating a path through the room, and Elena could hear the quiet murmur of respectful greetings being exchanged. An elderly gentleman was making his way through the crowd, moving with the careful but dignified pace of someone who was both respected and advanced in years. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair that was perfectly styled and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His black tuxedo was impeccably tailored, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never had to raise his voice to command attention. Elena had seen him earlier in the evening, seated at the head table during the dinner portion of the event, but she hadn't known who he was. Now, watching how other guests stepped aside and nodded respectfully as he passed, she realized he must be someone very important. Probably another wealthy donor or board member who wanted to see what all the commotion was about. She braced herself for more embarrassment, expecting him to glance at her torn dress and move on like most of the other guests had done. Instead, he walked directly toward her, his eyes focused not on the tear in her dress but on her face with an expression of gentle concern. "Are you all right, my dear?" he asked softly, his voice carrying a warmth that Elena hadn't heard from anyone else in the room that evening. Elena nodded quickly, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she spoke. She was acutely aware of Madison and her friends watching this interaction with obvious curiosity, probably wondering why this distinguished gentleman was paying attention to someone they had just humiliated. But then something strange happened. The elderly man's gaze shifted to Elena's dress, and his expression changed completely. His eyes widened slightly, and his hand moved instinctively to his chest as if he had just received unexpected news. He stared at the blue fabric with an intensity that made Elena uncomfortable, as if he was seeing a ghost. "That dress," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get that dress?" Elena swallowed hard, still clutching the torn fabric. "It was my grandmother's," she managed to say. She made it herself a long time ago. The man's face went pale, and Elena watched as he seemed to struggle with some powerful emotion. He took a step closer, studying the details of the dress with an almost desperate attention to detail. His eyes traced the delicate buttons, the careful stitching along the neckline, the way the fabric draped despite the damage. "Your grandmother," he repeated slowly. "What was her name?" Elena felt confused by the intensity of his interest, but something in his kind eyes made her want to answer. "Rosa Martinez. She passed away 2 years ago." The effect of those words on the elderly gentleman was immediate and profound. His legs seemed to give way slightly, and he reached out to steady himself against a nearby chair. Several guests moved forward with concern, but he waved them away gently, never taking his eyes off Elena. "Rosa," he whispered, and Elena could see tears forming in his eyes. "Sweet, wonderful Rosa," Elena felt a chill run down her spine. This stranger knew her grandmother's name, and the way he said it suggested much more than a casual acquaintance. Did you know her?" she asked hesitantly. The man straightened up slowly, composing himself with visible effort. When he spoke again, his voice was stronger but filled with emotion. "Know her? My dear child, Rosa Martinez was the most important person in my life for 30 years. She wasn't just my housekeeper. She was my family." The crowd around them had grown silent, sensing that something significant was happening. Elena could feel dozens of eyes watching this unexpected exchange, but for the moment she didn't care about their stares. This man had known her grandmother, had cared about her, and Elena desperately wanted to understand the connection. "I don't understand," Elena said softly. "She worked for several families over the years, but she never mentioned—" "Thomas Grandview," the gentleman said, extending his hand to Elena with old-fashioned formality. "This is my club, and Rosa Martinez saved my life more than once, in more ways than I could ever repay." Elena felt the world tilt around her as she realized who she was talking to. Thomas Grandview, the founder and owner of the country club where she was standing. The man whose name was on buildings throughout the city, whose family had been part of the community's history for generations. And he was telling her that her grandmother had been important to him. "Rosa came to work for my family when I was 12 years old," Mr. Grandview continued, his voice growing stronger as he shared the memory. "My parents had just died in a car accident and I was living with my uncle, who traveled constantly for business. Rosa was supposed to just keep house and make sure I was fed and got to school. But she became so much more than that." Elena listened in amazement as this distinguished man, surrounded by the city's most influential people, spoke about her grandmother with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "She taught me how to tie a proper tie, how to treat people with respect, regardless of their position in life, how to find joy in simple things like a well-cooked meal or a good book. When I was 16 and made some very poor choices with alcohol and fast cars, Rosa was the one who sat me down and helped me understand that I was headed down a dangerous path." Mr. Grandview paused, his eyes growing distant as he remembered. "And when I was 22 and our house caught fire in the middle of the night, Rosa was the one who woke me up and got me out safely. She went back inside to save the family photos and important documents, risking her own life to preserve the memories of my parents." Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to these stories about her grandmother. Rosa had never talked much about her work, always focusing instead on Elena's education and future. Elena had no idea that her grandmother had played such an important role in shaping the life of someone so prominent in their community. "She never asked for anything extra," Mr. Grandview continued, "never wanted recognition or special treatment. She just gave her whole heart to taking care of others. And she did it with a grace and dignity that I've spent my whole life trying to emulate." Madison and her friends had been listening to this exchange with growing discomfort, clearly realizing that they had made a terrible mistake. The young woman who they had just humiliated wasn't some random outsider who had wandered into their exclusive event. She was the granddaughter of someone who had been beloved by the most important person in the room. Mr. Grandview turned to look at the group of young women who had been tormenting Elena, and his expression hardened considerably. "I couldn't help but notice what happened here earlier," he said, his voice taking on an edge that made several people in the crowd step back slightly. "Rosa taught me that how we treat people when we think no one important is watching reveals our true character. She would be heartbroken to see someone's granddaughter treated with such cruelty, especially while wearing a dress that she made with her own hands as an expression of love." The silence in the room was now complete, with even the orchestra seeming to sense that something momentous was happening. Elena stood in the center of it all, still processing the revelation that her quiet, humble grandmother had been cherished by one of the most powerful men in the city. The silence in the ballroom was so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat. Mr. Grandview stood beside her, his kind eyes now sharp with an anger that seemed to make the air around him crackle with tension. Madison and her friends, who had been so confident and cruel just moments before, now looked like deer caught in headlights. Mr. Grandview's voice, when he spoke again, carried the weight of authority that came from decades of commanding respect in business and social circles. "Ladies," he said, addressing Madison's group with a tone that was perfectly polite but cold as ice, "I believe you owe this young woman an apology." Madison's face had gone pale beneath her perfectly applied makeup, Elena could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how to salvage a situation that had clearly spiraled far beyond what she had intended. "Mr. Grandview, sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Madison stammered. "We were just having a friendly conversation about fashion, and there was a little accident with the dress." "An accident," Mr. Grandview repeated slowly, his eyebrows raising slightly. "How interesting, because from where I was standing it looked quite deliberate." Elena watched as several guests in the crowd began pulling out their phones, not to record her humiliation this time, but to capture this unprecedented confrontation. She realized that Madison's cruelty had been witnessed by dozens of people, and now those same witnesses were seeing the consequences unfold in real time. "You see," Mr. Grandview continued, his voice carrying easily across the silent room, "Rosa Martinez taught me many valuable lessons during the 30 years she worked for my family. One of the most important was that a person's true character is revealed not by how they treat those who can help them, but by how they treat those who they believe cannot." He turned slightly to address the growing crowd that had gathered around them. "Rosa Martinez was the finest woman I have ever known. She raised me after my parents died, taught me right from wrong, and showed me what it meant to treat every human being with dignity and respect, regardless of their social status or bank account." Elena felt a warm glow spreading through her chest as she listened to Mr. Grandview speak about her grandmother with such obvious love and respect. All her life she had known Rosa as a woman who worked hard and loved deeply, but she had never fully understood how much impact her grandmother had made on the lives of others. "Rosa never asked for anything in return for her kindness," Mr. Grandview continued. "She never sought recognition or reward, but that doesn't mean her contributions went unnoticed or unappreciated." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through it quickly before finding what he was looking for. "Elena, is it? Elena Martinez." Elena nodded, still trying to process everything that was happening. "I've been trying to locate you for over 2 years," Mr. Grandview said gently, "ever since Rosa passed away. You see, your grandmother left something behind, but we had lost touch with your family and our lawyers haven't been able to find you." Elena felt confused. "Left something behind?" "But she didn't have much when she died. Just her little apartment and some personal belongings." Mr. Grandview smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, and his whole face transformed with warmth. "Oh, my dear, you are very wrong about that. Rosa Martinez was far wealthier than she ever let on." The crowd was hanging on every word now, and Elena noticed that even the orchestra had stopped playing entirely. Madison and her friends stood frozen in place, clearly realizing that they had made a catastrophic error in judgment. "Your grandmother worked for my family for 30 years, Mr. Grandview explained. "During that time I gave her substantial raises, bonuses for her exceptional care during difficult periods, and when I found out she was putting money aside for your education, I started making additional contributions to an account she didn't even know about." Elena's eyes widened as she tried to understand what he was telling her. "But more than that," Mr. Grandview continued, "I gave Rosa stock in several of my companies as part of her compensation package. At the time, those stocks weren't worth very much, but over the past 30 years they've grown considerably in value. Rosa owned those stocks when she died, which means they now belong to you." Elena felt the room spinning around her. "I don't understand. How much are we talking about?" Mr. Grandview's smile grew wider. "The last valuation was just over $800,000. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. Elena's knees went weak and she had to grab onto a nearby chair to keep from falling. $800,000. More money than she had ever dreamed of having. Enough to pay for her entire education, help her family, and still have plenty left over for the future. "That's impossible," Elena whispered. "She lived so simply. She never mentioned anything about stocks or investments." "That was Rosa," Mr. Grandview said fondly. "She never wanted charity, and she never wanted anyone to treat her differently because of money. She asked me to keep the stock ownership quiet, and she requested that if anything happened to her, the inheritance should go to you for your education. She was so proud of your academic achievements and your plans to become a teacher." Elena felt tears streaming down her face as the full impact of her grandmother's love and sacrifice hit her. Rosa had not only worked hard to support Elena's dreams, but she had also secretly ensured that those dreams would be financially possible. Meanwhile, Elena began to notice a commotion in the crowd as people checked their phones and started whispering more urgently to each other. She heard fragments of conversation that made her stomach drop. "It's already on Instagram," someone was saying. "Look at this caption. Rich girls destroy poor girl's dress at charity event." Another voice added, "The video has over 10,000 views already." Madison's friend tugged on her arm urgently. "Madison, you need to see this." Someone filmed the whole thing and posted it. People are sharing it everywhere. Elena watched as Madison grabbed her friend's phone, her face going from pale to completely white as she scrolled through the comments. The cruel laughter and deliberate destruction of Elena's dress had been captured on video, and now it was spreading across social media for the world to see. "This can't be happening," Madison whispered, her voice shaking as she read comment after comment condemning her behavior. "What kind of person destroys someone's grandmother's dress?" One of her friends read aloud from another phone. "This is disgusting behavior from privileged brats." "There's another video from a different angle," someone else called out. You can clearly see Madison stepping on her dress on a purpose. Elena realized that the same technology and social media that Madison's group had probably intended to use to humiliate her was now working against them. The evidence of their cruelty was being seen by thousands of people, and the public reaction was swift and harsh. Mr. Grandview observed this development with satisfaction. "It seems the court of public opinion is in session," he said calmly. Rosa always believed that truth has a way of coming to light, and that people who choose cruelty over kindness eventually face the consequences of their choices. Elena could see panic spreading through Madison's group as they realized the full scope of what was happening. Their faces, their names, and their cruel behavior were now public knowledge, being shared and commented on by strangers across the internet. "Mr. Grandview," Madison said desperately, "surely we can work this out privately. This was just a misunderstanding, a moment of poor judgment. I'm sure we can make this right." But Mr. Grandview's expression remained stern. "A moment of poor judgment is spilling a drink or forgetting someone's name. What I witnessed was deliberate cruelty directed at a young woman whose only crime was wearing her grandmother's handmade dress to a charity event. That's not poor judgment. That's a character flaw." Elena stood in the center of this dramatic reversal, still clutching the torn fabric of her grandmother's dress, but now feeling like she was in a completely different world than the one she had inhabited just an hour earlier. The humiliation was being replaced by a growing sense of justice, and the inheritance revelation had turned her from someone who barely belonged at this event into someone with more resources than most of the people in the room. But perhaps most importantly, she was no longer alone. Mr. Grandview stood beside her like a protective grandfather, and the crowd that had been watching her humiliation with curiosity was now watching Madison's downfall with disapproval. Mr. Grandview stood tall in the center of the ballroom, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making decisions that affected entire communities. The crowd had grown even larger as word spread throughout the club about the dramatic confrontation taking place. Even guests from other parts of the building had come to witness what was clearly becoming a defining moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Grandview announced, his voice reaching every corner of the silent ballroom, "I want to make something absolutely clear to everyone present tonight." Elena watched as he gestured toward her with obvious pride and affection. "This young woman, Elena Martinez, is the granddaughter of one of the finest human beings I have ever had the privilege to know. Rosa Martinez dedicated 30 years of her life to caring for my family, and she did so with a grace, dignity, and kindness that shaped the man I became." He paused to let his words sink in before continuing. "Elena came to our charity gala tonight to support the Children's Hospital, the same institution that helped save her younger brother's life. She saved her own money for months to purchase a ticket, and she honored her grandmother's memory by wearing a dress that Rosa made with her own hands." The crowd murmured with appreciation, and Elena could see several people nodding with approval. The story was spreading through the room, and she noticed that many guests were looking at her with new respect and understanding. "What happened here tonight," Mr. Grandview continued, his tone becoming stern again, "was not a harmless prank or a simple misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act of cruelty designed to humiliate someone based on their perceived social status." Madison and her friends stood frozen in place, their faces showing a mixture of fear and desperate hope that somehow this situation could still be salvaged. The phones around them continued to buzz with notifications as the videos of their behavior spread across social media platforms. Mr. Grandview turned to address Madison directly. "Miss Ashworth, I have known your father for many years. He has always struck me as a man of principle and integrity. I can only imagine how disappointed he will be when he learns about your behavior tonight." Madison's face crumpled as the full weight of her situation became clear. Not only had her cruelty been captured on video and shared with thousands of people online, but now one of the most influential men in the city was publicly calling out her character in front of the community's elite. "Mr. Grandview, please," Madison pleaded, her voice breaking with desperation. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But surely we can find a way to make this right. My family has been part of this community for generations, and that makes your behavior even more disappointing," Mr. Grandview replied firmly. "This club was founded on principles of character, integrity, and service to others. Your actions tonight represent the complete opposite of those values." Elena watched as Mr. Grandview straightened his shoulders and made an announcement that sent a shock wave through the crowd. Effective immediately, Madison Ashworth and her companions are permanently banned from this club and all its facilities. Their memberships and their families' memberships will be reviewed by the board of directors, and I will be recommending termination. The gasps from the crowd were audible. Being banned from the Grandview Country Club wasn't just a social inconvenience. For families like Madison's, it was a public declaration that they had failed to meet the community's standards of character and behavior. Furthermore, Mr. Grandview continued, "I will be personally ensuring that every board of directors in this city is made aware of what transpired here tonight. Actions have consequences, and those consequences should be meaningful." Elena felt a mixture of satisfaction and sympathy as she watched. Madison realized that her moment of cruelty was going to have lasting effects on her entire family's social standing. The young woman who had seemed so powerful and confident just an hour earlier now looked small and defeated. But then Mr. Grandview did something that surprised everyone. He turned to Elena with a gentle smile and spoke in a softer tone. "Elena, my dear, I know this evening has been difficult for you, but I hope you'll allow an old man to make a few suggestions about how we might honor your grandmother's memory." Elena nodded, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened. "First," Mr. Grandview said, "I would like to formally invite you to join the board of directors for our children's hospital charity. Rosa would be so proud to know that her granddaughter was helping to support the same institution that cared for your brother." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, and Elena felt her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. Just hours earlier, she had been saving pennies to afford a ticket to this event. Now she was being invited to help lead one of the community's most important charitable organizations. "Second," Mr. Grandview continued, "I think we should establish a scholarship fund in Rosa's name to help other young people like yourself pursue their dreams of education and service." Elena's eyes filled with tears as she thought about how much this would have meant to her grandmother. Rosa had always believed that education was the key to breaking cycles of poverty and creating better opportunities for future generations. "That's a wonderful idea," Elena said, her voice strong despite her emotions, "but I'd like to make a contribution to get it started." Mr. Grandview looked curious. "What did you have in mind?" Elena took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would surprise everyone in the room. "I'd like to donate half of the inheritance you told me about, $400,000, to establish the Rosa Martinez Memorial Scholarship Fund." The crowd erupted in amazed murmurs. Even Mr. Grandview looked taken aback by her generosity. Here was a young woman who had just learned she was inheriting life-changing money, and her first instinct was to give half of it away to help others. "Elena," Mr. Grandview said gently, "that's an incredibly generous offer, but you should take some time to think about it. That money could pay for your entire education and much more." "I have thought about it," Elena replied firmly. "My grandmother spent her whole life helping others, often at the expense of her own comfort and security. The best way I can honor her memory is to continue that tradition. Besides, $400,000 is still more money than I ever dreamed of having. It's enough to pay for my education and help my family, too." The applause that followed was thunderous. Elena stood in her torn dress, surrounded by some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the city, and they were giving her a standing ovation. Not because of her clothes or her social status, but because of her character and her heart. Meanwhile, security officers had quietly made their way into the ballroom at Mr. Grandview's signal. "Ladies," one of them said politely to Madison and her group, "we'll need to escort you out now." Madison looked around desperately, as if hoping someone would intervene on her behalf. But the same people who had laughed at her cruel jokes earlier in the evening now turned away from her with obvious disapproval. Her phone continued to buzz with notifications, and Elena could see that the social media storm was only getting worse. As Madison and her friends were led toward the exit, Elena felt a surprising emotion. Instead of satisfaction or revenge, she felt something closer to pity. Madison had thrown away her reputation, her family's standing in the community, and her future opportunities for a moment of cruel entertainment. The price she would pay was far greater than anything Elena had lost. Mr. Grandview seemed to sense Elena's thoughts. "Your grandmother taught me something important about forgiveness," he said quietly. "She believed that true strength comes from choosing compassion over revenge, even when revenge would be justified." Elena nodded, understanding what he meant. "I don't want Madison to suffer forever because of one terrible mistake, but I hope she learns from this and becomes a better person." "That's very mature of you," Mr. Grandview said with pride. "Rosa raised you well." As the evening continued, Elena found herself surrounded by people who wanted to congratulate her, to share their own memories of her grandmother, and to welcome her into a community that now saw her true worth. The torn dress no longer mattered. Her humble background no longer mattered. What mattered was the content of her character, the strength of her values, and the grace with which she had handled both cruelty and unexpected fortune. When the charity auction resumed later that evening, Elena made several bids with her newfound confidence. She won a weekend retreat that she planned to give to her mother, and a collection of children's books that she would donate to her brother's school library. As the night drew to a close, Mr. Grandview approached Elena one final time. "I hope you'll stay in touch," he said warmly. "I feel like I found a piece of Rosa again, and that's a gift I never expected to receive." Elena smiled, thinking about how proud her grandmother would be of this moment. Rosa's legacy of kindness, hard work, and dignity had come full circle, creating opportunities for Elena that neither of them could have imagined. The young woman who had entered the ballroom that evening feeling nervous and out of place was leaving as someone who belonged completely, not because of money or social status, but because she had proven herself worthy of the respect and admiration of everyone who witnessed her grace under pressure.